well-oiled team here. It's like we're of one mind. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Pattison Williams. I know many of you, and I'm really thankful for your support and attendance at these webinars. I'm coming from Treaty 6 territory, just southeast of Edmonton and the Miquelon Hills. And this is our monthly PHJV webinar. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Jeremy Hogan. He's the Director of Grasslands. He can correct me if it's quite wrong, for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And it's a real treat to have Jeremy here today. We've worked together a bit in the past, and I think we'll really look forward to hearing his presentation this morning. So if you can save your comments to the end, or just put them in the chat in case you forget them along the way, that's fine. And I will now turn it over to you, Jeremy. And if you want to turn your videos off too, folks, that's just a bit easier for bandwidth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. NCC has been proudly working with the PHJV for quite a long time. We have a number of members on the various councils and working groups and boards. So thank you for the opportunity today. I will get my screen share going. And we will talk about grasslands today. Gotta move all of you. And all right. So I am Jeremy Hogan. I'm the Director of Prairie Grassland Conservation for NCC. And we're here today to talk about the importance of our grasslands for our community, for our country, and for the world. Start with a little bit about who I am. So I always like to start with this slide just to make everybody aware that I am not an agrologist. I am not a bird biologist. I am not a rancher. I'm not an expert, and I know that many in this room are, and I never try and out-expert an expert. So I am an ecologist by background. I did my education at the University of Calgary. I got a degree in primatology, so I can I can out-monkey some of you, is what I could do. But I've always been a nature lover and an outdoor enthusiast. I was born and raised in Calgary. I spend my time outdoors as often as I can, whether that's biking the Highwood Pass, the highest paved road in Canada, sometimes meeting an avalanche path, whether that's hanging out in our beautiful prairie grasslands. That day in the middle there we were picking yarrow for the Rocky Mountain Soap Company as part of a collaborative opportunity with NCC. I'm a dive master, so I spent some time on the coast and I taught people how to dive in Vancouver's cold waters. And now I have a bunch of kids and I carry them around and get yelled at as I'm walking in beautiful places and don't get to enjoy the scenery or the birds as much as I used to. But I'm trying to instill that sense of wonder in them, and I'm hoping that it's effective and that they are the next generation of people that get to care for and enjoy these wonderful places that we have in our own backyard. So then, if I'm not an expert, why am I here talking to you? I did my master's and then I worked for the University of Calgary, but my work and my heart was in Costa Rica during those years. So I worked in the northwest corner of Costa Rica in a small park called Santa Rosa National Park that was built through, it was a national park designed to protect a historic homestead where the Costa Rican people defended their country against ironically, an invading group of Americans that tried to overextend their reach. And I think we can all have a sense of familiarity with that right now. The Costa Ricans won. They repelled the attack from the Casona, as it's called, and that set up the national park in the northwest corner. The people in the top of this slide are Dan Jansen and Winnie Hallwalks, and they're entomologists from the US. They're from Pennsylvania. They've been working in Santa Rosa since the 60s. And in the 70s and 80s, Dan and Winnie started noticing that fewer and fewer, the abundance estimates they were getting from their traps every year as they collected surveys were getting lower and lower results. And they started to wonder what was going on, and they started to realize that it was the result of ongoing conversion and habitat loss surrounding the park. And Dan kind of put down his microscope and his science hat, and he put on a fundraising hat and a conservation hat and got to work. And over the next 50 years, up until today, they continue to expand the park, is now the Área de Conservación Guanacaste. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it extends all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic across the northern section of Costa Rica. It's one of the world's greatest conservation success stories, I would say. And I got to work in that area, and I got to see the results of all that hard work that Dan and Winnie and everybody else put in. Because if you look at the population of primates, in this case I study capuchin monkeys, you see the population rebound from the 70s up until the 2000s, and now it's reached carrying capacity again. It's true of other primates, it's true of other animals. Dan and Winnie are still living in the park collecting. They mostly work on butterflies and moths these days. There's more than 25,000 species of moth in the area. And it just shows you how effective land-based conservation can be and how necessary it is in the ongoing face of habitat loss that we're seeing around the world and this biodiversity crisis that's brewing. So that led me to NCC. Dan and Winnie always had Dan specifically had a saying that when your house is on fire, you don't need a thermostat, you need a fire hose. And in his opinion and in my opinion, after working down there, the most effective fire hose we have is protecting area-based conservation, land-based conservation, whatever you want to call it. And I felt the need to stop academia, stop studying monkeys. The monkeys will be fine without me, and do what I can to ensure that the habitats and places that we care about back home here in Canada will be there for my kids, for their kids, and for generations to come. And to do that, I've been fortunate enough to work with the Nature Conservancy of Canada for the past few years. It's the largest conservation organization in Canada. It's a land trust, but it's also more than that. We are partnership driven. We're always looking for opportunities to facilitate other groups as long as it leads to durable conservation outcomes. And we are a non-advocacy kind of trusted partner. So we work with everybody because this is a whole of society crisis that we're facing, and we're going to need all hands on deck to figure out a way forward. Why do you think we need private land conservation in Canada? Well, I think that these two maps tell the story. So the overlap of biodiversity and human settlement is 1-to-1. I'm going to steal a pretty classic internet meme here, but they're the same picture. Humans settled in the places that are important to plants and animals, and plants and animals are losing the majority of their habitat in the areas where humans are at our densest populations. As well as the most agriculturally productive places in Canada. So there's a reason that plants, animals, humans all are in these areas, and it's because they're rich and they're productive. And that makes for good food production for humans. It makes for good places to live and enjoy the many wonderful things that life has to offer here in Canada. But it also means that there's this competing kind of race for space as the human population grows, as the need for resources grows, and as the amount of land available for wildlife declines. So just to talk a little bit about NCC's work in the prairies to date, there's about 500,000 acres that are under NCC stewardship. So that's either we've purchased some land, we have conservation easements or agreements, depending on your province, on private lands that are continuing to be owned, operated, and enjoyed by a landowner. We also support external lands. So we work with groups like Community Pastures in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, a little bit in Alberta as well these days. And we offer guidance and support for best practices for biodiversity preservation. But I think what's important to know is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So private land conservation requires private landowners to participate or private land managers to participate. And not every, not every solution, not every piece of property has the same solution available for it, for long-term durable conservation outcomes. So NCC is always looking for new ways, new mechanisms, new reasons for people to be interested in participating in the conservation process. And a lot of times people are already there. They just don't have the tools or the time to think about what should be done to ensure the long-term conservation of their habitats. And that's where a group like NCC can jump in. So it's a pretty varied approach because there's, as I said, every piece of land has a different context associated with it. It starts with science and planning. So NCC has world-class scientists We operate under the CARE principle, which is connected, adequate, representative, and effective. Those are the things that we're looking for on any land conservation project that we participate in. But then once we get to prioritizing where the highest need is and where the highest risks are for future conversion or degradation, that's where we start to implement the tools that we have available to ensure that those lands remain healthy and thriving in perpetuity moving forward. So just to go through a few different examples. Fee simple is outright purchase or receiving donation of land from a landowner. In this scenario, NCC ends up as the registered landowner on title, and we are obligated through our charitable status to steward that property in perpetuity for the benefit of all Canadians. So most fee simple properties across Canada that NCC manages are public access, and there's some logistics involved, particularly during hunting season, because we want to make sure that everybody is getting along and there's no risks associated with having too many people on site, for example. But these places are here for Canadians to enjoy, and I really do highly encourage you to look out and find out where your closest NCC property is and go see just how special these places are. Conservation easements, conservation agreements are a popular tool for the past about 30 years, and particularly in the prairies, where a lot of the landowners are ranchers, and they continue to live on and work on these grasslands, graze their cattle on them in a sustainable fashion. But they can sell the development rights to a group like NCC, who then holds them in trust. So what that means is when the landowner sells their property, the development rights don't go with the property; they remain with NCC. So this means that a lot of the typical conditions in an easement are things like no cultivation, no draining of wetlands, any logging and forestry has to be done under a sustainable management plan. But really, it's as long as the work that is being done or the enjoyment of that land is being done in a sustainable fashion, there are no restrictions on that kind of use. And then finally, facilitated hectares. So this is NCC has worked with governments of various levels, federal, provincial, indigenous, municipal, to protect very large, I'm talking hundreds of thousands of hectares of lands throughout Canada. So there's some examples in the Northern Territories, there's some coastal examples in BC, but probably the most relevant one to this group, given your interests, is the Tall Cree, the Birch River Wildlands, which was done in partnership with the Tall Cree First Nation, with Syncrude Resources, the Government of Alberta, and the Government of Canada. And what happened there was NCC was able to purchase the mineral rights that Syncrude held in the area and extinguish them. The Alberta government and the Tall Cree government worked together to form a management plan for the area, and the provincial government established it as a protected area. It is just outside of Wood Buffalo National Park, and combined with some other protected areas in the region, it represents the single biggest protected boreal area in the world at this point. Another thing that Albertans and Canadians can be very proud of, and you know, PHJV has been a part of that as well. So focusing back in the grasslands, I'm going to go into why we're focused on the grasslands in a couple slides here, but our goal through the Prairie Grassland Action Plan, which is my day-to-day these days, is to protect 500,000 hectares of grasslands by 2030. And that represents what we would anticipate seeing lost or degraded in that same time frame. So this gets Canada to a place of no new net loss between now and 2030. And it's an enormous number of hectares, but it's a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of things. We care about grasslands because they're essential. They owe their existence to the stewardship of Indigenous people for thousands of years. And in the Indigenous stewardship of buffalo and things like controlled burning and prescribed fire, for example, are what kept those grasslands healthy, functional, and thriving. So these are extremely culturally significant places and have been so for thousands of years. A good example is just south of me, the Milk River Ridge was one of the few places in North America that wasn't glaciated during the last ice age. And so this was a place that plants, animals, and humans all took refuge in, and it became a settled area of rich culture for thousands of years before colonial settling. But it's also, as we mentioned off the top, very important for biodiversity. There's more species at risk in the grasslands than any other ecosystem in Canada. There's a lot of endemic hotspots in the prairies because of the unique habitats that are established and the kind of microdiversity that occurs through the frequent disturbances that happen. And then there's also food production. I mean, this is the breadbasket of Canada in a lot of ways. Native grasslands are compatible with sustainable grazing practices, but it also is rich, fertile soil that produces a lot of the crops that we rely on as humans that need to eat. Just to touch on ranching and grassland conservation a little bit, I think it's a really interesting working landscape is what we can call it. And there's a lot of evidence from numerous studies over the last 20, 30 years that sustainable grazing is actually beneficial to the health of our grasslands. So originally when Grassland National Park was established, cattle were excluded from the block and the grasslands degraded. And the new action plan that's in place for species at risk management includes grazing. And that's because as long as you're moving cows in the right way and you're controlling kind of how long they're spending time in any specific area, you get different heights of grass and different diversity of plants in that area based on the grazing patterns of that animal. This used to happen from bison, from buffalo. Obviously, there are significantly fewer buffalo in the Canadian prairies at this time. We're seeing some reestablishment in some places, but cattle can serve as a substitute or a proxy if they're managed sustainably. And that leads to these different habitats that leads to different colonization by groups like our grassland birds, for example, who like different heights for things like nesting and feeding and breeding and all that fun stuff. There's a really nice film out called Guardians of the Grasslands. If you're ever interested, it's about 15 minutes long. It talks about some of the work between cattle ranching and biodiversity conservation. There's a flip side to this too. Native grasses and native habitat is good for ranching operations as well. It provides better year-round forage. Things like there's better protein in some of our native species that remains in the stem instead of being shunted into the roots during the low seasons. There's some evidence that cattle can get better gains from some of these species. You require lower inputs because those plants are native to that habitat and they don't require the excessive management and fertilizers and things like this to establish them. And then there's water capture. So because of that structure difference and the different heights and the different densities of our native plants and forbs, snow can be captured a little more effectively. And then there's these really deep root networks on our native plant species in the grasslands that will suck a lot of that moisture really, really deep into the ground. And as you can see on the corner of this kind of artistic rendition, they go meters in some cases into that ground. And something like a Kentucky bluegrass, for example, it's only about 3-4 inches deep. So there's major differences in the root structure and the diversity of plants in a native system. And all of this spills off farm and provides benefit to the whole community. So we talked about water management. There's evidence from kind of the Central Plains in the US that native grasslands are crucial for the restoration of groundwater recharge. So if you convert too much land, you end up with significantly reduced groundwater stores, and that leads to major irrigation issues moving forward. So there's a push to restore grasslands in the Central Plains, specifically to get enough water recharged into the groundwater for people to drink and for crops to be irrigated. It prevents things like floods and droughts. Alberta's a great example of, we have extremes in precipitation change throughout the year. So you get a lot of snow in the winter, it stays there, it all melts at the same time in the spring, at the same time we're getting heavy rains. And if there's no native habitat kind of on the way out into the prairies to capture all that runoff as it occurs, you get major flooding like we had in Calgary about a decade ago. It will also cause things like sediment erosion from having that really fast volume and flow rate of water that's not being kind of captured and slowed and restricted by the complex structure of a native habitat. On the flip side, once all that water rushes off the landscape in the spring, by the time you get into the middle of summer, it's all gone because nothing was capturing it, and you end up with extreme drought. And that's something that we've been facing increasingly in the past few years. Wild animals are also providing a ton of ecosystem services for the community. So there's a paper from a couple NCC scientists that demonstrated that the native grasslands that are surrounding crop production lands in the Prairie, Canada area, specifically flowering plants, so things like berries are a good example, but other plants as well, anything that requires a pollinator. Those native pollinators are providing $3 billion worth of services and the equivalent of feeding 25 million people a year. And the paper then goes on to demonstrate that if we were to strategically restore just a few key areas of the prairies, we would double that production value. So $6 billion in services and 50 million people equivalent fed every year just from these native pollinators. Pest control is very similar. There's some papers in the States that demonstrated that what they're calling a simple landscape, which is a monoculture of crop production, has about 50% less pest control services from native species. And that requires triple the amount of things like pesticides to be input into the system. There's a really crazy paper that came out this past year that demonstrated that lifespan in areas is actually correlated, infant mortality specifically, was correlated to habitat complexity because of that input of pesticide into the system, getting into the food supply and increasing the rate of infant mortality. It shows you the links between the importance of keeping native habitat in place and the benefits it provides to that community. And just to give you an example of the catastrophic costs of conversion, so you can see in this chart that every year we've seen an increase in the amount of insurance payouts in Canada. And a lot of those are caused by disasters that would have been at least partially mitigated with some natural infrastructure in place to help reduce the destruction. So there's a lot of work in the prairies right now focused on evaluating natural infrastructure and trying to figure out how to build those into our economic models and ensure that the landowners providing those natural infrastructure goods are being rewarded for doing so. And then finally, as I said, our grasslands in Canada are good for the world. So in addition to having biodiversity that's unique to Prairie, Canada, and we have a kind of an obligation as Canadians to continue to protect these endemic species and globally significant species. Canada is predicted to be a climate refugia, so we'll see a lot of habitat shifting occurring in the coming years as things get hotter and drier throughout North America. And you might see movement of plants and animals, and having intact grasslands in Canada provides somewhere for them to go if the southern range of their distribution becomes uninhabitable. But perhaps the biggest story is the carbon storage. So because of those deep root networks and the way that grasslands pull carbon deep into the roots, the ends of the roots decompose, there's bacterial mats at the bottom of those root networks. There are billions of tons of carbon stored in Canada's prairies. And there was a study from Nature United and co-authors in 2020 that demonstrated that avoided conversion of our grasslands is the single best natural solution that Canada has to mitigate the effects of climate change over the next 20 years. So better than reforestation, better than any single energy system change, just not converting any further grasslands is the single best thing we can do for the next 20 years. And that is billions of tons of carbon saved stored in the ground. It's also more resistant to things like fire, because if you get a wildfire like we had in Jasper last year, a lot of the carbon stored in trees is gone in a heartbeat. Grasslands, most of the carbon is deep underground. Fire is a natural part of the system. It burns off the top a little bit, but that's not where most of the carbon is. The carbon is underground and it stays there even during that fire process. So the only way that carbon is released is during something like a plow digging up the top 30 to 60 centimeters and disturbing that bacterial growth and then causing atmospheric release. So all of that to say that everything is better together. Humans need to eat. I like food. I would like my kids to not starve to death. And Canada is a critical place for food production for the world, and particularly as we move forward into this new era. But there is overwhelming evidence that things need to be in balance, and there needs to be native habitat as well as crop producing lands and other land uses for humans in the same area. And I think the prairie potholes is just a beautiful example of it, and I'm sure that this picture resonates with all of you. of the mosaic of land use types and habitat types is what makes this place special and so rich. Unfortunately, it is becoming less and less common. So I think this slide speaks volumes. More than close to 2/3 of North America's grasslands have been already lost. In Canada, that number is more than 80%, and that's because that is the area of food production and human settlement. And it's not just a historical thing. So yes, a lot of the conversion happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but we're still seeing tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of hectares converted every year. And with that, all the native plants and animals that went with it. So grassland birds, I saw Kyle was on the call. Birds Canada released a really great study last year that demonstrated that 2/3 of the abundance of grassland birds in Canada have disappeared since the 70s. And when you look at just obligate grassland birds, so birds that need to live in native grassland habitats, so things like Sprague's pipit, it's 90 to 95% of those birds have disappeared in our lifetimes. It's a staggering number, and it's a horrifying number. And you can see that it is by far the most threatened bird group, bird clade, that Canada hosts. And it's not just birds. So pronghorn, buffalo have been all but extirpated, although there is some progress there. Swift fox, there's countless examples. There's more than 60 species at risk in the prairies. And we got here because of us. This is human caused. So the number one driver is conversion of land for human uses, but there's also a lot of fragmentation and a lot of degradation. So incompatible land use practices and incompatible linear disturbances. And all of this is the result of grasslands not being protected. So less than 6% of Canada's prairie grasslands are currently considered protected or conserved. And climate change is making all of this worse, of course. So incompatible land use coupled with drought leads to degradation, for example. So why is this happening? A lot of it, because most of this land is agricultural, a lot of it is economic based. So you can see on the left, even though they use different scales and it drives me crazy, land that is considered marginal land, and we'll talk about that in a second, but native habitat, native grassland, is worth less than 1/3 of the sale value of that parcel than converted tilled land is. And when you combine that with the fact that in most years, we're in a bit of an exception right now, crop production and cash crop value per acre is significantly higher than producing livestock or beef, most typically in North America, on that same land. You end up with a no-win scenario for the people that own that land and are trying to operate it as their livelihood. And they're faced with a very difficult choice. And oftentimes that difficult choice results in conversion. That also is being exacerbated by demographics. So more and more existing landowners and those that own large parcels of intact native habitat in the prairies are getting older and looking for succession planning. But buying land is extremely expensive. A lot of the younger generation can't compete for land or have moved and have become increasingly urban. And there just isn't that next generation stepping up and stewarding grasslands through things like ranching. So what ends up happening is those landowners have no succession plan, or their succession plan is to sell. And unfortunately, at the time of sale is by far the riskiest time of conversion. So most of the time, if not, I shouldn't say most of the time, but a lot of the time, if land is bought, it is bought for conversion to a crop producing landscape. The final piece, and I'm going to get to that marginal piece here, is that grasslands just aren't really well known or thought of, and the ranching industry has always been kind of denigrated in the environmental conservation world. So if you ask, there was a study done by the Canadian Wildlife Federation last year, supported by the Weston Foundation, that demonstrated that fewer than 20% of Canadians feel comfortable saying that, yes, I know what a native grassland is, I know what it looks like. And even fewer than that knew that grasslands were extremely endangered and that we had lost most of them in Canada. So they're not even known outside of the people that are working on them, as a good example. They're also, I mean, the fact that they're considered marginal land in a lot of land classification systems speaks volumes to me. They're not thought of as productive, cherished landscapes that they should be, providing all of this value to the world. And then the final piece is that, yes, ranching has had a negative environmental conservation perspective because of the impacts of carbon from cows. But what isn't captured in that story is the importance of grassland conservation and the carbon value that those grasslands provide, and the fact that those grasslands remain intact because of careful stewardship of generations of ranchers. So what do we do about all this? I've painted a pretty bleak picture. I'm going to try and go on an upswing from here. I think the first piece is that we just need to change the conversation. So there's a lot of groups right now that are working to tell a better story about how important grasslands are, how everybody in Canada and everybody in the world relies on our grasslands for climate stabilization, for water services, for biodiversity, for food production. There's also this chance that we have to tell a better story and to work with working landscapes. So with ranchers, with other grazing associations, with other food producers, to build a more sustainable food system and to share the story of sustainable food systems with the world. And beyond getting the general mindset of Canadians and the general public changed about how important grasslands are and that we need to take action now to conserve what remains, we can support the people that are continuing to steward and keep those grasslands intact. So there's a lot of reconnection to the land opportunities. Indigenous people have been extremely displaced from this landscape, largely in part due to the way that land was divided and ownership was established during settlement of Prairie, Canada. And there remains a lot of barriers in place for reconnection to the land and for Indigenous conservation. So there are great opportunities, and there's groups like the Treaty Land Sharing Network in Saskatchewan that are providing these models of how we can start to reconnect Indigenous people to the land and how we can learn some of the really effective stewardship practices that were in place for thousands of years, keeping these places healthy. We can also support the landowners currently working and ranching these lands through things like financial support for stewardship or through knowledge transmission and sharing of best practices. So a good example of that is I've been working with the Weston Family Prairie Grassland Initiative Stewardship Investment Program. We call it SIP in-house. And that has been providing funding to ranchers who are partnered with NCC or another delivery partner, typically a conservation organization, but also community pastures and grazing co-ops throughout Prairie, Canada. And they work with staff to identify opportunities to implement stewardship that would enhance biodiversity, but also bring net benefit to their operation. So things like offsite watering units and portable electric fences are very popular in that program. And we've done more than 900 projects influencing 1.8 million acres to date, which is just an incredible story, and built a lot of really good relationships out of that too, which leads to this normalization and socialization of conservation practices not being scary and being good for business. We can also try and close that gap that I was mentioning between the value of crop and the value of beef production. And we can do that through stacking various incentive programs, and payments for ecosystem services is a popular way of saying it, on top of the actual price of cattle that are sold. So a good example of that is that NCC has been working with the Climate Action Reserve to establish the voluntary offset market for avoided conversion of grasslands in Canada. It's the first grassland market in Canada, and we are hoping to have the first project live this year. And that landowners that participate will receive payments for their carbon sequestration that comes from avoided conversion. So this isn't an additionality carbon market. This is an avoided conversion carbon market. There are challenges with the protocol. So a good example is that the threat classification used to decide values or eligibility for entry is probably overly restrictive and doesn't account for the actual conversion risk that we see in Prairie, Canada. And to be worthwhile for a landowner, right now you have to have a very large plot of land. I think it's over 1,000 hectares, for example. And we're hoping to make some changes with the protocol developer to bring in more opportunities for various landowners. There are other markets as well. I don't think anything is as far along in actualizing at a scale of the carbon market, but biodiversity markets, natural infrastructure payments. We've seen some examples elsewhere in the world. So in England, there is now a biodiversity net gain mandatory market where any land use has to be offset by a 10% biodiversity net gain in the country. And you see things like the global biodiversity framework taking shape that might lead to more rigorous reporting standards for business. And those opportunities all present opportunity to then lead to payment for ecosystem services for the people that have ecosystem services to sell. Oh, I need to click through this. I keep forgetting to delete the animation. This is just an example of all of the various potential opportunities that are forming in Prairie, Canada. And this isn't an exhaustive list. We haven't updated this in a year, but there are countless opportunities, and it's up to us to figure out as a society and as a community which ones are going to move forward and which ones are actually effective at leading to biodiversity conversion and are interesting and exciting enough for landowners to participate in. Finally, policy reform. So NCC is not an advocacy group, but we are here to support conservation practices and to identify opportunities to lead to durable conservation. And I think that policy plays a big part of that in the grassland world. We've seen examples of policy working through work like what PHJV does and waterfowl conservation. Wetlands were identified as extremely at risk, and that was resulting in reduced waterfowl populations. Policy was enacted throughout North America that made it reduce the rate of wetland draining and conversion, and that has led to a significant increase in waterfowl populations throughout North America. These kind of opportunities exist for grasslands as well. It's politically tricky, and it would be something that would have to be thought through with great care, and we would have to make sure we weren't leaving landowners behind and causing inadvertent consequences, but there are policy opportunities to protect grasslands. Some other examples are in the US, there was a really interesting paper that demonstrated that the clean fuel regulations that were put in place in the US led to an increase in ethanol use for fuel, and that directly led to grassland conversion in all of the areas surrounding ethanol refineries. So there's these perverse incentives that happen through bad policy as well that could be worked on. Similarly, in agriculture, I've heard from many people that there's fewer opportunities for things like insurance available for cattle producers versus crop production, and it's actually leading to people choosing to produce crops. I also thought this was really interesting preparing for this talk, is that everything I've just talked about is in PHJV policy priorities, and I'm really excited to see that, and I think that there's a great path forward, and I'm really happy to know that the grasslands are being recognized as important. All right, so that brings us to the Prairie Grassland Action Plan. So as I mentioned, we are trying to conserve 500,000 hectares of grasslands by 2030. That is not like NCC owns 500,000 hectares. That is not 500,000 hectares of easements. That is conservation that has durable results behind it. So it's going to be a whole of society approach. It's going to take a lot of different people and tools and opportunities to come together and work together. And the four major strategies within this action plan, I can put the document in the chat after, is supporting public land conservation. So a lot of the high value intact grasslands remaining in Canada are on crown lands. So old federal pastures, the PFRA system, which are now community pastures in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Excuse me. But there's also crown land in Alberta, such as Suffield Base and the special areas and lots of other places. Facilitating Indigenous-led conservation. So this is providing reconnection to the land opportunities, learning from Indigenous stewardship traditional practices, and also supporting Indigenous-led conservation efforts. So things like Indigenous protected and conserved area development through Indigenous-led action. Accelerating private land conservation. So this is kind of NCC's historical bread and butter. We've been doing this for decades, but there's a clear recognition that the tools that we have available are not the tools that everybody is interested in working with us through. And to do more in Prairie Canada, we need more incentives and more opportunities and more tools for landowners to be willing to work with us or with others to result in permanent conservation outcomes on their landscapes. And then finally, continuing to support resilient landscapes through stewardship and restoration. So this is supporting external landowners and land managers. This is working on NCC lands, and then finding key corridor areas that can be restored back to native habitat. And as I said, this is a whole of society thing. This is too big for NCC. This is too big for any one organization, and it's too complicated to not work with everybody. So we are looking actively for partnership opportunities, and I would love to hear from any of you on the call today if those exist. Excuse me. So we're a couple of years in now, and we've had some good success. We have about 100,000 acres conserved to date, and through actions like the Weston Family Prairie Grassland Initiative, another 200,000 enhanced, 5,000 restored. We've raised $100 million through this, so I think that demonstrates that people are interested, and once they become aware of the issues with grasslands conservation, they want to be a part of the solution. And we have some really cool, unique Indigenous-led projects in each province too that I'd be happy to talk about. But we're always looking for new and interesting opportunities as well. And then we are starting to work with governments of various levels, municipal, provincial, Indigenous, federal, to look at public land conservation opportunities. And there's this designation called Other Effective Conservation Measures, OECM designation. And that is if a land is not, if the primary use of that land is not for conservation, but conservation is compatible with the land use, it can be considered conserved and still be contributing to the solution of ensuring that we keep our native habitats intact and thriving. And just in general, what can everybody do about it? I think that the message is very clear that we need to continue to celebrate and share the story of grassland significance and the importance of the people that work in the grasslands, the relationship between people in grasslands and working landscapes in grasslands. And just make sure that we're not thinking of it as marginal lands and that it is a significant place for us all. Conservation enabling policy, so there's lots of opportunity there, and I think that there are really interesting things happening in that space, and I'm looking forward to contributing where I can. And supporting grassland stewards and conservation-minded practices. So this is supporting your local conservation organizations, your bigger conservation organizations, your land stewards, anybody who lives on, works on, cares for grasslands, just help them out. With that, I will say thank you, and I'll leave this slide up for a minute. You can screenshot or write something down, and then I'm happy to answer questions after I stop coughing.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That's great. We didn't hear you coughing, but just I did see the water there. So thank you so much. So a round of applause, virtual or otherwise, for Jeremy. Really appreciate. Yeah, what an excellent presentation. Very, very thorough overview and of the good work that NCC is doing and the collaborative approaches. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm sure that everyone here has some questions for Jeremy. We have about 10 minutes or so. I'm just looking at some of the questions in the text box that I could read out. I see, yeah, Joanne Havelock, you have some questions sort of a political nature. I don't know if those Jeremy wants to respond, but maybe we'll start with one of those. As we think of a Canadian federal election coming, what are some of the key points to raise about grasslands that you would think? You can also say to pass if you prefer. So.
Not at all. No, I think there's enormous opportunity. I know that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has been interested in thinking about sustainable practices. I think that they've been thinking more about the sustainability of the food production system rather than the sustainability of native habitat. But I think those are two sides of the same coin. And I think that by elevating the opportunity to produce, the only way we get to a sustainable food production system is by ensuring that there is a mosaic of habitat and native habitat alongside those crop production lands. So I think that is an opportunity to put in front of the government, and this is like an agriculture, food security, food sovereignty based system that benefits all Canadians. And I think that would be that would be something that whichever government ends up in power would be of interest.
Great, thank you. Yeah, politically sort of regime proof, really. Yeah, like you say, those sort of things. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Joanne, I hope that sort of captured that question. Shifting, I see Kyle Drake, you had a question. Why don't you turn your video on and oh, and before I get you to speak, Kyle, just to note that this presentation has been recorded and will be posted on the PHJV website by this afternoon. So if you would like to share it or look at it, again, hang off every word that Jeremy said. You can go back there this afternoon. Kyle, would you like to? Yeah, there you go. Sir.
Yeah, I don't know that it really needs the attention, but yeah, just noting that there's a lot of us, I think, that are watching this and taking this in that are pretty aware of the problem and the challenges. And yeah, I see that there's a wider segment of society that kind of needs to get the message. And I realize different groups are working on it, but this is a great presentation that I just wonder how to get it out, aside from having people go to the PHJV's YouTube channel and stumble upon it. And anyways, I don't have the answer. Hey.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I should highlight that I think I touched on, but I probably didn't do justice, is the Canadian Wildlife Federation, that same study that they did that demonstrated grasslands need to be known more prominently by your average Canadian. They have since formed a group called the Grassland Awareness Coalition. And that there's about 20 organizations working in that coalition, including NCC. The continuance of the survey was that Abacus, which is a polling firm, has taken a bunch of messaging and done, what's the word? I'm losing it. Like focus groups with Canadians to find out what messages resonate and how we could effectively have a campaign moving forward. And the messages have just been studied and vetted, and their recommendations are coming. And over the next year, leading into the UN International Year of Rangeland Pastoralists in 2026, there's going to be a marketing campaign. And that's I mean, not a huge amount of money, but tens of thousands of dollars will be spent sending grasslands significance messaging into the general market in Canada. And that is an exciting opportunity.
Great, thanks for that question. And yeah, I see Pete Joyce said maybe a Netflix miniseries would do it. But I mean, the PHJV YouTube channel is, nearly as popular as Netflix. So if we get Susie Miller, I see your hand up, and then I'll jump back to some of the comments in the text.
Yeah, hi, Jeremy. I'm Susie Miller with the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. Yeah. And I think that has been an ignored audience in terms of crop producers, because they're the ones that make the decisions, that buy the land and put it into cropland from native prairie or, even tame pasture. And I'm wondering, is there an opportunity for our organizations and the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture to work together on an approach to get this type of information? I agree with Kyle. This is great stuff. And one of the things is that there isn't a recognition among crop producers of the value of having native grassland surrounding their cropland. And, it's like preaching to the converted, right? You got to preach to those who are most likely to make the decisions. So that's just an offer. It's something to think about, John, in terms of how PHJV could work. And I'm offering the CRSC entree, I guess, into the crop. And we do have a meeting coming up on April 15th in Winnipeg. If somebody from the Nature Conservancy would like to do a presentation, I could pre-record it, or in person, I'd certainly give you a forum right there.
That would be fantastic. Yeah, Susie, please.
We'll talk.
Yeah, that would be great. And we have, if I can't make it to Winnipeg, I'm sure somebody from our office could, and that would be fantastic. So.
And thanks, Kyle, for stimulating this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susie and Jeremy. Just looking, I'm going to do one of the text box, and then Pete Joyce, you're next. We have a comment from Trevor Harriott. talking about just a question around the Aspen Parkland region, and is that included in the NCC's plan for conserving 500,000 acres by hectares by 2030?
Sorry, I was reading comments while you were talking, John. I shouldn't have done that. Okay, what was the question?
No, it's all good. Just, if Trevor, you're welcome to speak out too. I don't want to.
Yes.
Yeah, the Aspen
Trevor,
Parkland.
yes, thank you. So NCC's the Prairie Grassland Action Plan is very holistic. It includes some of the ecoregions that ECCC's Prairie Ecozone doesn't include, because we thought that there was a lot of importance of animal movement corridors and water systems in place that needed. It's a holistic system, and we didn't want to just be focused on grasslands, like getting into the weeds of what defines a grassland and what isn't and all that stuff. So our action plan encompasses the Aspen Parkland as well as the boreal upland pockets within the Prairie Ecozone.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks for the question, Trevor.
I'll stop reading comments and let you do it.
I mean, you can read as well as I can, but Pete, Joyce, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Great presentation. Thanks very much. So building on what Susie said, I think I totally agree that we need to be looking at ways to work with ranchers. We need to be incentivizing that good stewardship. I guess a lot of us tend to think, at least my corner of the world in Saskatchewan, that a lot of the loss is happening on private lands, and it's those smaller patches that, like Susie's suggesting, I think is coming into the hands of annual croppers, and maybe there isn't full appreciation of the value of those smaller patches of grasslands. Maybe they're not guys who have cattle. Maybe they're not partnered with neighbors who have cattle and want to use those areas. But there are benefits. So I agree with those that are saying we got to sell that up a little bit. You referred a lot to working with ranchers and incentivizing good behavior and using market-based approaches like offset systems and so on to kind of supplement their income and bring down that differential between annual cropping return and return from beef production, for example. What about working with those annual croppers? I mean, building on what Susie's saying, I think there's the awareness piece, but I kind of wonder if we're forgetting about a segment who really are important actors in the loss of native grasslands. And we tend to work with those good guys, the ranchers. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but are we needing to maybe supplement that a little further with trying to encourage those sort of sustainable annual crop production, system management, and keeping grasslands in the mosaic as part of the overall strategy? I'm just interested to hear what your thoughts might be around that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. It probably just wasn't as prevalent in my talk because it's not a space that NCC has traditionally been involved in, but we are now thinking a little more systemically, and that so an example I can give is that our science and planning prioritization tool is called Where to Work. It's co-hosted by Carleton University, and initially we were only looking at remaining intact habitat, but there is now opportunity to look at are there places that could either have restoration or some like a stewardship action put into degraded or converted lands that would be more optimal than finding a comparable intact habitat. So there might be priority areas that are heavily converted and have those remaining fragments, and those fragments would serve as the core to build out from and kind of that defend the core conservation concept. And then it could even be used to create linkages between, let's say, a national park and a provincial park. And then you could have a connected corridor through those isolated habitats along route. We have an agriculture policy manager. She started last year, so it is something that NCC is thinking about. It's just new to us, and I don't have good slides for it yet, is what I would say.
So I'd love to chat some more about that offline. We have a similar kind of a strategy baked into a draft habitat management plan we're building for Saskatchewan. The idea of sort of stitching the patchwork quilt back together by managing linear disturbance and fragmentation within grasslands in the same way that we're trying to approach fragmentation in the boreal, for example. So yeah, love to chat about that a little further if
that would
you
be
wouldn't
awesome.
mind getting in touch. Yeah,
Perfect.
thanks.
Thanks, Peter.
Great. And if, yeah, there are any points of connection, you can email Jeremy, or if you don't have his email or captured there, you can reach out to me and I can connect you. Maybe one last question, and that's from Talha from the Smart Prosperity Institute. Thank you for your presentation. Are there a couple of examples of Indigenous-led projects in the prairies that you see forthcoming, Jeremy?
Yes, I'm excited about a lot of them. So I'll start. The one that I got to go to right when we started our action plan was I had a picture in the deck. It was called the Wabano-Wake project, and that started as it's a private lands east of Brandon. It's a couple thousand acres, and a private landowner was looking. He was a rancher. He was retiring, and he wanted to ensure that his grasslands remained intact. So he worked with NCC to sign a conservation agreement. And then a couple years after that, he met a guy that was picking echinacea in the ditch outside of his property. And they started up a conversation. They started up a friendship. And he started inviting, the guy's name is Roddy. He started inviting Roddy onto his lands to collect traditionally significant plants. And it turned out that Roddy was, he's an Anishinaabe healer, and he works at the Brandon Healing Lodge. And he was using the land to collect medicines for traditional practices. And that's become this really interesting friendship and partnership now, where there is a healing lodge established on Wabano-Wake, which the land is now called. Ceremony is conducted there, harvesting is connected there, and this all started, you know, with very little involvement of NCC, but it was making the connection between a landowner and an Indigenous traditional practitioner, and having the land available to access. And it was a super cool happenstance, is what I would say, that led to really great things and has become kind of a model for how to build these connections elsewhere throughout the prairies. On the other side of the prairies in the west, this isn't an NCC thing, but the Blackfoot Confederacy has a guardianship program for the Eastern Slopes right now, and NCC owns a lot of land just outside of Waterton Parkfront, and we're looking for opportunities to work with the Confederacy to maybe have guardians-like stewardship of some of those lands, and provide some more reconnection opportunities down there. In Saskatchewan, Old Man on His Back is a great example, right? We have a buffalo herd on Old Man on His Back, and we've been able to partner with nations who are looking to get their own buffalo herds reintroduced and offer them, animal husbandry training, but also provide bison to reestablish. So those are a few examples, and I expect to triple that list very soon.
Yeah, thank you. And that was interesting last fall when, Jeremy and I were both at the Buffalo Treaty celebrations down on the Blood Tribe in the fall too. So there's a lot of stuff around bison rematriation as well going on. So, well, thank you. The last comment was, maybe you can get some sort of segue or sort of cameo performance on Heartland,
If somebody knows an agent.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you so much. And I think, again, applause to Jeremy for this work. Please reach out. His email is in the chat if you'd like that. And please refer back to the PHJV YouTube channel if you want more information. I'll also note two other things. One is that our April meeting will be on our people willing, how much are people willing to pay for bird habitat conservation? So that's Dr. Howie Harshaw and Dr. Katie Sainsbury will be speaking in April on that, so stay tuned. And also what a great flow from this is, it was in the PHJV newsletter, but there is a launch of the Grassland Learning and Knowledge Hub that will on the 25th of March. And I think many of you will receive a link to register for that. And that's an exciting new initiative, I think, that will wrap up much of the work, even stuff, Jeremy will be involved, I'm sure, in some of that. Around bringing all this knowledge around grasslands and what we do about it together. So stay tuned for that too. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday and look forward to the next meeting. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.